Please join me in welcoming Deborah Jermyn.
Thank you for the very generous introduction, Cathy, and for the invitation to be here. I'm really impressed that there's so many people here on a Monday afternoon, so lovely to see you all. So in 2013, the BBC launched The Fall, starring Gillian Anderson as Detective Superintendent Stella Gibson and Jamie Dornan as a serial killer of women on the loose in Belfast. The series was a hit. So much so that having premiered to an audience of 3.5 million, it won a commission for season 2 before the first season had even finished airing, and it was picked up by Netflix in the US, doubling the BBC's average audience share and the channel's biggest drama launch in 8 years at that time. So our murderer, Paul Spector, has already killed when the series opens, and he's identified straight away. But unwitting police in Belfast failed to link the murder of his first victim to new cases. And it's the Met detective Stella Gibson, brought in to review existing police work, who astutely spots the similarities and makes the connection. All of Spector's victims are young, accomplished women, working as lecturers, solicitors, architects, and their professional credentials are matched by their kind of sex-positive confidence as very modern women, all of them killed through a process of lingering, sadistic strangulation. Now, the writer, Alan Cubbott, has some important credentials in the genre, formerly having written Prime Suspect 2. And 20 years on, he was again nominated for a prestigious Best Miniseries BAFTA for The Fall, as he had been back in 1992 for Prime Suspect. And The Guardian's Sarah Dempster was one of many in the media to heap rapturous praise on this new series, describing it as a relentlessly original, consistently gripping, vast-brained, 5-part psychological thriller. In October 2016, the 3rd season was broadcast. Again, much anticipation, generated huge buzz. Just kind of get a sense of how many people have seen the series, how many people... Okay, right, so quite a lot of you, that's interesting, good. And so, not to give any plot spoilers, but if you saw it through to the end, it's difficult to, or impossible to imagine it would continue in the same way, but there has been some kind of chatter about whether the series might continue in some shape or form. But what I'm interested in today is what this series might tell us about the state of play for women in TV crime drama. Importantly, this is a genre which holds what one might call an amplified relationship to representations of gendered violence. And how do the politics of this matrix unfold in the post-feminist moment that we find ourselves in? Who are the genre's idealised or ideal women victims at this time? What do women detectives need to do to make the cut in an era in which it seems, on the one hand, they are more prevalent than ever before, but also on the flip side of this, where it seems that they must somehow do more to survive? So the presence of a female detective in itself is no longer worthy of remark. It's no longer a novelty, as it was 20 years ago when Prime Suspect first came to our screens. So what does a woman detective need to do to get a season renewal today? So I'm just going to take a quick look at the trailer to give you a sense of how viewers were introduced to the series.
Coming soon to BBC Two.
Kathy. It's Kathy, I don't know how to get back onto slides, or I don't use Max. Anyone know how to get back onto the slideshow?
Just get hold your mouse down at the bottom.
Sorry.
It should come up here.
Here. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm not seeing it. Is anyone escape? Sorry. I'm not doing anything. Oh, I don't use Mac, so I'm not sure what's happened. Okay, thank you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Just a little pause.
Okay, so obviously the trailer kind of gives us some hints about what to expect. Things that are evident from there is, again, the sense that we will know the killer straight away. This isn't a whodunit. And also, I think, importantly, it's about this kind of relationship between the detective and the killer. That there's this kind of quite seductive relationship immediately being suggested by this kind of rather haunting, quite beautiful music, and the sense of them kind of watching one another, and obviously this kind of trick it plays on us that we think she's the one being stalked, but in fact she's the stalker, setting up this kind of a sort of cat and mouse relationship, but also I think a kind of almost this kind of sense of desire between the two. And I want to suggest that the series' self-conscious engagement with feminist discourses or issues can be seen as absolutely fundamental to its success. The Fall, I would argue, speaks to a media culture where ratings can be won via a superficial but glossily packaged nod to post-feminist gains, which in actual fact serve only to dress up a deeply regressive and misogynistic impulse. And the series was described by The Atlantic magazine in 2013 as the most feminist show on television, using my title today. And it's solely the first season that I want to focus on today, as I talk about the reception of the series and briefly my own deeply troubled response to the arrival of The Fall. Now, alongside The Atlantic, elsewhere, for example at Bitchflix, they too applauded the series, as they called it, manifest feminism. And yet I found myself driven into a kind of virtual apoplexy as I watched by what I'd found to be its hateful representation of women. And in an article that I've written about it, I kind of admit to scenes of kind of shouting at my telly as all this was unfolding. And I want to bring this experience to bear in what follows, moving somewhat outside the usual constraints of academic studies and academic studies of crime drama, not into exactly autoethnography as such, but not claiming entirely a kind of detached scholarly analysis either. So I'm kind of interested in starting to think about how do we make a legitimate space for such an approach within feminist criticism of this genre, where we might start to speak about these kind of angry responses that can be provoked. This was a show which made me reassess my own engagement with TV crime over a period of many years. And in particular, it led me to revisit my early work on the original Prime Suspect, which Kathy mentioned at the start, a series which eventually amassed 7 seasons, but which was first broadcast back in 1991, and which I'd done a BFI book on in 2009. So I'm presuming most people are familiar with Prime Suspect. They have some kind of awareness of this. Obviously, a really significant generic predecessor. A series which, like The Fall 20 years after it, starred a highly regarded woman actor, here of course Helen Mirren as the D.I. Jane Tennyson, again playing a senior police detective who works on a serial killer case, who comes into that case kind of after it's commenced and does work which brings together information and clues which other male officers had missed, in order to find the man responsible for raping, torturing and murdering a series of young women. And, of course, importantly, it featured disturbing and graphic images which at that time were unprecedented for TV crime drama. So kind of new ways of really showing some of the horror of what happens to these brutalised victims. And if we go back to the series today, I mean, I don't think those images shock in the same way because they have become so commonplace. But it's important to remember that at that time, it was hugely successful and it proved to be hugely influential, received as groundbreaking. Crucially, putting a woman police officer at the front of a murder case, and a murder case of this particular kind. The idea of pushing the boundaries of what could be shown on TV, and these kind of return to explicit scene of crime images, that kind of detail, in the process becoming one of the most lauded instances of the genre in TV history. And when I was writing about it, what I was kind of really compelled by was how it had very deftly and innovatively explored the spectrum of contemporary misogyny. By on the one hand, exploring this kind of deadly violence against women in the form of a serial killer, but interweaving that with this representation of kind of everyday, institutionalised sexism as you watch a woman police officer trying to work, trying to advance in a very kind of masculine institution, navigating the police service. Now, 2 decades on, as I watched The Fall and found myself railing against the explicit imagery adopted there, I had to ask myself, had I unwittingly played a part in promoting such violence? As a writer and an academic who'd been an early champion of what I saw as a feminist politics at the heart of Prime Suspect, had I somehow been complicit in this popularisation of a televisual movement which has normalised and propagated an everyday discourse of increasingly graphic violence against women in TV crime drama? And my ire at this programme was prompted both by the particular nature of The Fall's salacious representation of the murder of women and its simultaneous, disingenuous evocation of a feminist consciousness. So it's both absolutely revelling in this kind of hideous violence against women and doing so under this kind of bravado of pseudo-feminism. And to use Angela McRobbie's evocative phrase, we might say this was a spuriously drawn double entanglement. So in the aftermath of feminism, her book, McRobbie explains the double entanglement as follows. She writes, "Postfeminism can be explored through what I would describe as a double entanglement. This comprises the coexistence of neoconservative values in relation to gender, sexuality and family life with processes of liberalisation. Feminism is at some level transformed into a form of common sense while also fiercely repudiated, indeed almost hated." And in this respect, I want to argue that The Fall exemplifies what the cultural critic Joanne Clark-Dillman has identified at the centre of what she sees as a contemporary preoccupation with dead women in the media. And she talks about this across the reporting of both true crime and fiction. So she thinks examples from the book and the film of The Lovely Bones, for example, through to real news crime reporting of murdered and abducted women in news coverage. And these are women whose bodies, she says, echo and visually intensify a discourse that posits women as disposable and replaceable in the era of liberalism and globalisation. So making a very powerful and, for me, persuasive polemic, she argues that, quote, "The rancour and ambivalence surrounding the feminist project are manifest in the surfeit of women who need to be dead before an exploration of their lives, subjectivities and experiences is authorised in mainstream representations." So I think that Clark-Dillman's analysis thus provides a compelling framework to inform feminist readings of The Fall. Because to talk about Stella Gibson without also talking about the tortured and murdered women that serve as the prompt for her work, the dead women who allow her to showcase her place as a powerful woman in the 21st century police service. To talk about one without the other, I argue, would be to persist with a unforgivable critical omission. As someone who previously worked on Prime Suspect, I was immediately struck by the similarities, and I pointed to some of these already. Like Prime Suspect, The Fall then, starring this kind of established, highly esteemed woman actor. Now we have Gillian Anderson here, doing kind of a kind of skilled detection where her male colleagues have failed, working on this kind of case that's eluded other officers around a single serial killer. And like DCI Jane Tennyson before her, Stella Gibson is this kind of driven, committed professional with a kind of steely air. Like George Marlowe before him, George Marlowe, the serial killer of Prime Suspect. The serial killer here, Paul Spector, is not a freakish loner, but an attractive, everyday guy in a relationship with a loving partner. In fact, here he's also a father and works as a grief counsellor. Like Prime Suspect, The Fall depicts that murderous handiwork with graphic attention to detail that produces a debate in the media around how much can we show, how much is it acceptable for television, is permissible in this genre. So, given all this, why was it being described as, quote, defying the genre's conventions by The Atlantic? Why was The Guardian pronouncing, if there's a more original anything this year, I'll eat my squeaky rubber truncheon? Hadn't we seen a lot of this before? Well, if there's a motif that might be taken to crystallise the success of The Fall in a marketplace heaving with TV crime dramas, so I'm taking this as a kind of an object that crystallises what was seen to make this programme different and new, it would be Gillian Anderson's blouses. In fact, I'm also going to say it would be Jamie Dornan's torso. So we'll come back to Jamie Dornan's torso, but think for a moment about these blouses. So, we know that Gibson has been flown in from the Met Police as an expert to come work in Belfast to lead a review of their stalled investigation of Alice Munro's murder. Her skill and authority, unlike many of her generic predecessors, is never in doubt. So there's no one that ever kind of suggests that she's not the right person for this job. She quickly ascertains this undetected serial killer is actually picking off a series of young professional women and is very quickly held up in the media reception of the programme as being a kind of icon for working women. And this is partly for this kind of unendingly cool demeanour, so she's absolutely unflappable, all the difficult interactions that she's faced with, she rides them out. Nothing, not even the office suicide of a colleague, seems to ruffle her feathers. But more than anything, this status of iconicity for working women was endowed on her for nailing the convoluted intricacies of the modern woman's workplace wardrobe. And in particular then, this unparalleled collection of pastel-toned silky blouses. So, The Telegraph and The Guardian both reported in summer 2013 that ASOS and French Connection had noted a spike in silk shirt sales following the show's broadcast. And a plenitude of fashion stories doting on Stella followed. So loads of coverage of the programme, which is actually centred on how can you two look like Stella Gibson? So this included features in Stylist magazine and The Telegraph, where Gibson featured in a gallery of women examining, quote, the TV wardrobes that put the pow in power dressing. And meanwhile, Tracy McVeigh's Guardian article was entitled Now, everyone wants a silk shirt to look as cool as TV's sexy sleuth. And she conjured up Gibson's blouses by saying she's not afraid to show her sexuality. In fact, she positively bristles with it. Her blouses are an iconic part of the character. Silk, cleavage enhancing under a well-cut suit, and defining her as a professional woman not afraid of looking attractive. And all this chimes with Rosalind Gill's account of the, quote, pervasive sexualisation of culture under postfeminism, and the shift in representation of women, as she says, from sex object to desiring sexual subject. And the imperative here then is that women should constantly aspire to be sexy. They should remain, quote, forever up for it, as Gill would put it. Not just in their own time, though, but in the workplace too. But this wasn't remarked on as a problem for the series' popular reception. Instead, we have a steady production line of these Stella Gibson memes and GIFs all over the internet. So you see this one here, what would Stella wear? It's from a magazine article where you have a still from the programme, but then how can you go in the shops and buy a similar outfit? But these other ones, you can see where this kind of slogan, what would Stella do, as kind of symbolic of how we might emulate her. And this is very much how we might emulate her through her sexiness and fashionable silky blouses with a cleavage enhancing. So not only is she managing to be this kind of hugely productive detective and managing to do all this in a always ironed silk shirt, she's also managing along the course of the programme to make time to detour to a crime scene and proposition a hot young detective she spots there, giving him her hotel room number within seconds of meeting him. The Fall, Bitch Flicks concluded triumphantly, has given us a new, uber-cool feminist heroine. But while these stories were extolling the feminist credentials of the series and the cool confidence of its heroine, who and what weren't they talking about? In the endless column inches and internet pages dedicated to Gibson's blouses, I feel a glaring absence. Where was attention to the other highly stylised women of the Fall? The ones bound, gagged, strangled, undressed, bathed, dressed, posed and photographed. The ones seen begging for their lives, flailing, fighting, with skirts pulled up round their waists, hands tied behind their backs, thrown on beds, with bruised flesh and opaque pupils laid out on gurneys. The coverage described here provides a smokescreen for not talking about other women. It's a facade erected around the show to make it somehow seem woman-centred, as if a woman protagonist is all a text needs to claim that worthy moniker. And I'm interested here as well, I think we can make a kind of similar way of thinking about the reception of The Killing. I don't know if that's something else that people watched here, and it was a series that I watched sometime after it was broadcast, but I was very much aware at the time of broadcast of everyone talking about the detective Sarah Lund's jumpers, and there's constant coverage of where can you get a Pharaoh jumper that looks like this, kind of quirky, memorable woman detective. Lots of focusing on that, and then very little attention to the fact that this is also a series, again, about kind of really brutal murder of a young woman who kind of gets left out of the narrative that appears in the discourse that follows. So as the series unfolded, I watched The Fall with a kind of sense of disbelief and rage at the nature of and sheer amount of screen time devoted to scenes of extreme violence against women, at its eroticisation of sexual violence against women, and its delight in building anticipation that ends with the climax of assault. But we also need to think as part of this about representation of the killer. And titillating and sensationalistic, its feminist heroine is also continually intercut with admiring scenes of the hyper-athletic killer, who I have to say removes his shirt at every opportunity. People familiar with Jamie Dornan at all? So he's a former Calvin Klein underwear model. But I think as you look at this, it's not necessarily obvious like, which is the modelling picture and which is the still from the fall. But this is the Calvin Klein modelling picture. These three here are all stills from the series. But yes, this kind of continual, one source of pleasure in the programme is seeing his physique, seeing his body as he prepares, as he trains for the kill. So lots of sequences of him, kind of working out, pumping up his muscles and, strengthening his grip before he then goes out to stalk and kill these women. But do you recognise what this frame is from in the bottom right-hand corner? Does this know this one? Anyone?
50 Shades.
Yeah, it's from 50 Shades of Grey. So the next major role that he was cast in following the fall is Christian Grey in 50 Shades of Grey. So again, I kind of invite you to make the connections around his star meaning and the use of this actor in this way. So also point you to this image in the top right hand corner, which you perhaps can't make out, but the slogan on that t-shirt says Spectre's Victim. So this is merchandise that you can buy on the internet. So this is part of the discourse that starts then coming out where kind of fans and are talking about the series as a kind of line of, well, if I was going to be stalked by a serial killer and he looked like Jamie Dornan, I wouldn't have a problem with it. That kind of reception, making it kind of flippant, but there's all kinds of ways in which you might analyse what's going on in a response like that. But it tells you something about the kind of novelty of having this super sexy serial killer in the series. And the editing continually reminds us that Stella too is an erotic object, of course. And what becomes striking as you watch this series is the amount of cutting that takes place across the killer and Stella. So wherever she might be just going about her everyday business, you have scenes of her where she's swimming alone in the pool, or she goes to meet a friend at a bar, and we will kind of cut back and forth with seeing what she's doing and what Jamie Dornan, Spectre, is doing. This building to suggest that this kind of connection between them and this kind of certain simpatico desire, for example, cutting to Spectre during a sequence of her having sex with the man that she's just picked up from the crime scene. And we're going to watch an extract from that in a moment. And I think we see that again, as I said earlier, in the trailer, that it's kind of setting up this kind of frisson between them very early on. And of course, she's not just an erotic object, but a potentially vulnerable one. So regardless of how many degrees she holds, regardless of how powerful she is in this role in the police, there's absolutely always a sense that, she too could be overwhelmed by him, overpowered by him, made a victim. And that is much even more strongly seen in the second season, if you watch that and saw how the narrative progresses there. And repeatedly, she's made to mirror the victims or to take up their position visually. So, for example, we have scenes of her gripping her own wrist as hard as she can, where she's taking up position both of the killer and of the victim in a sense, where she wants to sort of feel like, how strong would I have to be to kind of hurt myself, and kind of reproducing that sensation of kind of grip of strangulation. We see her painting her nails the same colour as we see Spectre paint the nails of one of his dead victims. There's another sequence where we see her going to lie on one of the victims, Sarah's bed. So going to the crime scene and putting herself into the position, the physical position of the victim on the crime scene, on the bed, imagining what would have happened to that woman there, how she was tied up there, and kind of reconstructing it with her own body. There's numerous ways in which these kinds of moments of her mirroring victims occur. But this notion of there being some electricity between the hunter and the hunted in the thriller and the crime genres is not unfamiliar territory, of course. Lindsay Steinberg, for example, notes that a sexualised and romanticised attraction is commonplace in narratives that play a female profiler of a male serial killer. And it interestingly bled often into real life also, in the way the show was promoted, where they would quite often get the two of them on a sort of chat show sofa and have a kind of flirty, sort of sparky chit chat together. And I was really struck by this image from Red magazine in 2013. Red magazine was very much enamoured with the programme and endorsing it. And so they do an interview with the stars, and it was illustrated with these photos. And I was looking at them thinking, well, this looks like almost like the promotion of a rom-com. Yeah, and then you kind of think about what's actually going on in the text. And this attraction between killer and cop inarguably operates as part of the series' erotic appeal. So that increasingly in the series, the lines between sex, sexiness, and sex crime blur. So I want to show you a brief extract now, which I think kind of exemplifies this discomforting territory very strikingly, and it is a sort of disturbing sequence, I should say. It's taken from the start of episode 2. Paul has just killed his second victim, and we have this kind of prolonged scene of him playing with the dead body of this woman, dressing it, photographing it. And this is intercut with the scene where Detective James Olsen goes to Stella's hotel room, her having just given him her room number. So we basically intercut between scenes of their sexual encounter and Spector's necrophilia. This one. Okay.
I wasn't sure this would you, man.
It's what I meant.
I should take a shower.
No need. I like it.
I just have spoken about the importance of thinking about editing, and there's obviously that moment at the end which shows this very well. So, what connections are we being invited to make, where we have this kind of image of a woman's dead body being thrown on a bed, and then we cut to Stella's body, like laid prostrate in exactly the same position. So all kinds of uncomfortable conflations being made there. I kind of still don't quite know how to interpret that, but I'll leave you to think about it. But basically, something's gone wrong when a headline in the Daily Mail asks what you're thinking. Why does the BBC think violence against women is sexy? So Christopher Stevens describes it as the most repulsive drama ever broadcast on British TV. The Fall doesn't challenge evil, it wallows in it. The BBC has made a serious error of judgment, their worst mistake yet, in a succession of flawed dramas that present violence against women as either trivial or erotic. So whilst there was a kind of huge amount of excitement and applauding of this programme, there were some voices as well which obviously spoke about misgivings about the kind of glamorisation of the murder of women that we see in it. And subsequently, the Telegraph voices a riposte to this in an article entitled "The Fall May Be Repulsive, but it's right to show the graphic murder of women." And Michael Deaton comments here that every year around 85,000 women are raped, another 400,000 are sexually assaulted. I mention this by way of defending The Fall. TV dramas are full of raped and murdered women because our society is full of raped and murdered women. It's true to life. And if it is graphically disturbing, well, so it should be. But absolutely no awareness here or contemplation here of processes of mediation. And the fact is, the defence made by those embracing the show can often be called persuasive. Outwardly, the series seems to champion a post-feminist picture of progress. After all, between them, the various women that we get to see in The Fall are making their own money, they're the boss, they get to have it all by often being a kind of successful working professionals, and sometimes doing the whole kind of families and husband thing too. They're working, as I said, as lecturers, architects, solicitors, medics. They get to be taken seriously in these professions, even though they favour these kind of girly high heels, tight pencil skirts. They get to call the shots on when they have sex and with whom, regardless of whether or not they're in a relationship. The fact remains, however, that these post-feminist women are precisely the ones too that the series punishes virulently. The white, educated, economically independent, sex-positive young woman is the poster girl for post-feminism, as McRobbie and Gill tell us. And though, while through Gibson, the series may seem to celebrate the achievements of this modern woman, through the protracted scenes of violence against the victims, it also annihilates her. The Fall reminds women to navigate the world in fear, even as they reap the rewards of the second wave. And whilst the series was kind of received, as I've said, as a kind of lots of excitement about its originality and kind of like resetting the coordinates for this genre yet again, I'd like to say that actually, rather than cutting new material, Stella very much belongs to another iconic history, that of the femme fatale. She's highly fetishised through her constricting pencil skirts, her preposterous high-heeled shoes. You saw a bit of that when she was going down the cobbles in the trailer. How can a woman that's we're being expected to believe kind of is working kind of 15-hour days and sleeping on a camp bed in her office get up and put those shoes on to go to work? The textures of her long, loose hair, these tactile, silky blouses, her mastery of the gun, the phallus, when we see her go to the shooting range, and the fact that the men that she sleeps with end up dead and shot. So sex with Stella, like Paul, is deadly. And so just, this is a still of Stella here, but you can see how neatly it fits with these other images from that visual history. She's a spider woman, a Hitchcock blonde, an ice maiden, and for all her seeming post-feminist progress, an archaic archetype. Having said all that, there's no denying the fall is very adeptly put together. It's smart TV, or gives the illusion that it is, with quality television pretensions. So you've seen a little bit of that, the beautiful lighting, some of the set design, kind of really inventive sets and camera work where the cameras are able to kind of move over the partitions between rooms in the set, making kind of literary references to T.S. Eliot and so on. Within this, it knows how to capitalise self-consciously on feminist discourse, so it signals its feminism. For example, Stella insists in a police press statement that the wording is amended to remove a reference to the dead women as innocent victims, and she points out this is a value judgment, and anyone that's kind of worked around kind of crime in the media knows that that is a kind of really commonplace intervention now. She even invokes Margaret Atwood's famous line that men are afraid women will laugh at them, while women are afraid that men will kill them. And the Fall does a wonderful job in these moments of adopting a feminist discourse. And then it delights in showing us women being picked off by a sociopath with a thing for hot young brunettes, while he himself is pursued by a woman wearing improbable high heels. So is this, then, one way to secure your woman cop a season renewal? Deliver post-feminist lip service to feminism, disguising pre-feminist scorn. So I want to conclude just by returning briefly to my opening consideration to kind of reflect a little on how a mode of feminist criticism of TV crime drama might enable the entry of an element of self-conscious or kind of anecdotal contemplation into scholarly writing on the genre. Because it seems to me that throughout an academic history of looking at TV crime, I've always been watching both as a woman and as a feminist scholar, which are clearly two interrelated but not interchangeable things. So intellectually, as a feminist scholar, I can identify the elements of the Fall that enable a feminist reading of it. And it's important to say my intention here is not at all to reproach viewers who have enjoyed the series, partly for having interpreted it that way. It's not about kind of identifying bad feminists or to suggest that they have misunderstood it. So I think it's rather the disingenuous nature of the double entanglement of post-feminism is precisely that it facilitates these simultaneous and conflictual responses to the feminist claims of popular culture. Nevertheless, as a woman tired of negotiating endless media violence against women, I do not feel convinced by claims to the series feminism. And instead, I share Clark Dillman's sense that the graphic deaths by sexual violence and the after effects of this violence on the woman's body visually nullify the agency gained by other powerful women figured within the story space. Watching The Fall, I felt I'd never seen something so violently misogynistic on television. And when I look back at my notes, I'm taking watching it closely for kind of a textual analysis, I find that at moments I'd written notes to myself to say, I'm shaking. And I reflected that those kinds of images that first startled me in 1991, when Prime Suspect introduced new levels of forensic realism around its murdered woman, had become absolutely par for the course. Prime Suspect now looked veritably restrained, in fact, as TV crime drama increasingly took the exploration of the brutalised female corpse to be its default narrative prompt. So this is the way that so many crime drama series now commence. habitual content, a quotidian mainstay, and I had become weary of it. Did I change then since 1991? Did television change? Of course we both did. And post-feminist culture was doubtless significant in both instances. I cannot watch The Fall in the way I watched Prime Suspect more than 20 years ago, because now I've seen too many dead and brutalised women discarded, discovered and laid out on mortuary slabs. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions, but we'll also go to our tea room afterwards if you want to talk more personally with Deborah. Questions?
Is everyone too depressed to ask questions?
Yeah, Holly.
Thank you for that talk. I really like the way that you kind of unpacked the way that the misogyny of the show is sort of hidden in plain sight, even though it's sort of exposed in
Yeah.
the post-feminist show.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could maybe comment on the way that whiteness intersects with the post-feminism of the show. Like, I don't know if there's any,
Yeah.
if there's a black woman in the show, because it was interesting that trailer that you showed at the beginning, it showed like a white guy walking down the street putting on a hoodie,
Yeah,
so he can
yeah.
hide in plain sight.
Yeah,
because he's
yeah,
white,
yeah.
and then that's followed up by the kind of white post-feminist.
There is a woman playing who works in the morgue, Archie Punjabi. So a key role there by a woman who's not white, but it's mostly white. And I think very much with Stella, again, it's that kind of sense of intense whiteness because of her hair and because of the pastel blouses. So this kind of sense of, that, which what's the kind of thing that Richard Dyer talks about, of how whiteness can be made to kind of glow. I think you get kind of moments like that around how she's lit. And that, again, is what I was really struck by, of how she links to that imagery, that iconic history around the idea of the Hitchcock blonde and the femme fatale. So yeah, that is very much part of that way that post-feminism was initially very much conceptualised, although I think there is now increasing work to say that we need to think about how black women are addressed by this as well, and how they're subject to it as well. Yeah.
Annabelle?
I was really interested by your juxtaposition of The Fall with Prime Suspect. And I haven't actually watched The Fall, but I certainly know Prime Suspect. And I wonder if you would answer your own question. Is the problem, did Prime Suspect precipitate the problem? Do you think?
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that I don't remember Helen Mirren wearing those blouses or their equivalent at all. Something that was.
It is different, and I did have this sort of like.
And is it a failure of subsequent series sticking to a formula that they then take somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, so it was this, when I started watching this programme and thought, I'm going to have to write about this, and I had this kind of moment where I thought, if you stand up and really criticise this programme, the most obvious thing anyone can say to you is, well, hang on, you like Prime Suspect, you defended Prime Suspect. So I had to kind of really think that through. And I think one of the really important differences is that in Prime Suspect, you never see a woman being attacked. You never see the actual moment of stalking, abduction. There's none of that. Whereas in this series, there are prolonged scenes of women, being strangled on beds, being tied up. All of that is made very much visually the repertoire of violence. Whereas in Prime Suspect, we get to see the after effects because we see scene of crime photos and we see dead bodies and we see them in the morgue. So I think that was an important difference. And yes, Helen Mirren is filmed differently. There's a whole kind of interesting thing here going on around kind of ageing women as well, because when Prime Suspect came out, there's a lot of kind of interest in, Helen Mirren's let herself being filmed in this really brutal light, and we can see her lines, you know. And Gillian Anderson, I think, is interesting in that respect as well, as an actor who's spoken about the sort of pain of being a woman in the public eye, ageing. But I think here is, you know, very much that idea of the kind of the desirable, still got it, slightly older woman. So I think there's something different going on there. If you think back to Prime Suspect as well, there's these jokes about, you know, like the guys in the station saying, oh, who'd do that? You know, is she a dyke? All that kind of stuff, which is never around her because she's unquestionably a desirable woman. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting indeed. I was just wondering what sort of rating or any sort of to the general public before they saw this on their own television, I presume.
Yeah.
There were some sort of warnings given as to what they're likely to be seeing, so they don't
Yeah, I mean,
come across it unwillingly, shall we say?
I'm not sure. I did watch it when it's actually being broadcast, and I'm not remembering there being any viewers may wish to, you know, kind of use their discretion. I don't think there was any signalling like that. I mean, it was a kind of 9 o'clock screening, so actually quite early in the watershed screening slot. But I think that is, you know, a demonstrative of the fact that our expectations of what you can show in the genre have just been pushed back so much further than we imagined from 20 years ago. So, yeah, I'm not aware of you know, how it would have been broadcast elsewhere. Was it ever cut anywhere, edited? You know, I'm not kind of aware of that happening, but I don't think that there were kind of viewer warnings around it. Yeah. Yeah.
Quick question. Great talk. Thank you. I'm aware of the Christian connotations, but apart from those, why do you think they've called this the Fall?
I think it is part of that kind of signalling of quality credentials. Yeah, and as it goes on, there are sequences where Paul, you know, sort of demonstrates his intellectual, you know, standing by citing literature. So it's part of that, you know. So I think it's, you know, it's lending it this kind of quality sheen. Will you get the reference when he starts doing those, citing those writers, poets? Will you know what he's talking about?
Well, he's set up as this Nietzschean killer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then that is actually made explicit when they start finding his crazed notebook where he's got these kinds of, you know, excerpts that.
And all of this free.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Killer, thank you. Even though I felt sick a lot of the time you were talking about it, but it did help me realise why I just couldn't even watch the first one. I didn't even know why I didn't put it on, because I do have watched a lot of, you know, obsessively for years, different types, culturally, you know, like the Belgian one I saw recently or a Russian one, whatever.
Right, yeah.
But what I'm really interested in is the two reviewers were male. I don't know who the writers are. Is there anything about the women who are acting it, how they've been affected by it, or other women who were involved? I mean, sometimes I wonder, because often I see mostly men involved with producing something other than the producers, which might be women, not the directors or the writers, but. So I'm sort of interested in that whole process around.
I mean, it was both male writers and directors, and the writer became the director in the later season, and there was some of his. He commented that he said of the first one certain things were filmed in a way I wouldn't have done, which I think was a kind of acknowledgement of salaciousness without actually like really putting the blame for that.
But no checks and balances or
No.
different. And has Gillian ever come out to say anything about like
Yeah, I mean,
regretting it? Like
yeah.
there was an image of Sharon Stone and that.
Yeah.
And she really regretted that role, didn't she?
The stuff that I've seen from Gillian Anderson has been that she's proud of this work and that she regards it as a kind of feminist intervention.
Right.
And she's also been...
Well, I don't admire her so much.
well, I started following her on Twitter after I started getting into the programme, and I think she's a really interesting figure, but because she's also
been so Americanised by some sort of...
Yeah, she's published this book as well about feminism and talks a lot about ageing, and she's been really unusually, given the pressures that put on ageing women's styles, I'm usually kind of vocal about talking about this sense of grief about getting older, talking about menopause. Yeah, so she did a kind of a big live event at the South Bank Centre Royal Festival Hall, talking about this kind of co-written feminist book that she'd produced. So I think for me it's interesting that she's clearly taken up that platform, but hasn't spoken anything I've seen about problems of reading this programme that way. Yeah.
Well, please join us in the tea room if you want to talk to Deborah further. Thank you.